Salvete omnes. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to continue with our coverage of Caesar today. We skip ahead quite a bit. We just did the first seven sections of Book 1, and then we skipped the rest of Book 1 in Latin. We skipped Book 2, we skipped Book 3, and the first half of Book 4. So we will pick up here in line 24, or not line 24, in section 24 of Book 4. At this point, Caesar is trying to land his ships on the island of Britain. He is conquered Gaul. Well, conquered Gaul. He's at least been successful enough in Gaul that he has expanded all the way up to what would be the English Channel, and is now trying to make it to the island. So let's see how he gets along. So 424. At Barbari Consilio Romanorum cognito, praemiso equitatu et essidaris, quo plurimumque genera in prolis uti consuerunt, reliquis copiis subsecuti nostros navibus egredi prohibebant. All right, so here's our first sentence. Starts off with what's going to govern the rest of the sentence, ut barbari, but then we get two ablative absolutes and a relative clause in here to kind of keep us in suspense about what the barbarians are going to do. So, but the barbarians, ablative absolute, Concilio Romanorum cognito, with the plan of the Romans learned or figured out, perhaps. And we don't have an et here, or a quet or something like this, but here we do have a second ablative absolute with the plan of the Romans known, with the equitatu et essidaris praemiso, with the cavalry and charioteers sent out. And this is a little bit of a weird ablative absolute. Praemiso is ablative, singular, going with equitatu, but it's also governing essidaris. So it should probably be in its purest form a plural, but he keeps it singular here, kind of because of its proximity to equitatu. So with the cavalry sent out and the chariots, so you could kind of look at it that way. Perhaps he forgot and didn't want to go back and erase as he was writing. So with the cavalry and chariots sent out, quo plerumque genera in prolis uti consuerunt. So now we get a relative clause here. This relative clause governing the previous ablative absolute. So referring to probably more to the charioteers here. But it's technically quo genera. So quo is going with genera here. So you have, to some extent, the antecedent is actually inside the relative clause itself. Which method, which type, genus, right? This is genus, so it gives us the word like genus and species. So, which type, and this is ablative because uti is an infinitive that takes an ablative. It's a deponent infinitive, utor uti usisum. It is deponent, but it always takes an ablative object. So they use quo genera. They use this type, or perhaps they use this method the most, plerumque. They use it the most in proilies, in battles. And then you get, I guess we should go to consuerunt since that's governing our infinitive. So with the cavalry and charioteers set out, they are accustomed to using this method, this type, the most in battles. So ablative absolute, relative clause. What were we talking about again? Oh, right, the barbary. The barbarians, with all of that taken care of, reliquis copiis subsecuti nostros navibus egredi prohibebant. Having pursued, perhaps, having followed, kind of like period, or having pursued, they prohibit our men from leaving the ships. And then you get reliquis copiis here, which should just be Oh, is that could be dative, perhaps going with subsecuti. So having followed the remaining sources or the remaining forces, not going to say sources, supplies or forces, one of those two. Your book tells you in this case it is an ablative. At least the Mueller tells you it's an ablative with cum missing, which Caesar usually puts his prepositions in there, but you do have that. So kind of having followed with like the rest of their forces, they prohibit our men from getting off the boats. So I'll go through that all again in one nice chunk. I'm actually going to start with the ablative absolute. So with the Romans' plan known, and with the cavalry and charioteers, the type that they are generally accustomed to using in battle, sent out, the barbarians, having followed with the rest of their forces, prohibited our men from leaving the boats. An important thing to note with Caesar whenever he talks about the Romans, he's never included. At least he's never involved. It's not they prohibited us from leaving the boats. It's always our. So it kind of speaks to all Romans, whether the Romans were there or not. It's still the Romans' army. Right? It's still the Roman soldiers. It also kind of separates Caesar the writer from Caesar the general. So he's just an unbiased observer in this. They prohibited our men. I'm just simply a Roman expressing this to you. It prohibited our men from leaving the boats. So something to look out for as we go through. Caesar never, I don't think, ever or rarely refers to us or to us. It's always our men. All right. Second sentence. Erat ob has causas summa difficultas. Summa difficultas. I'll get that word right. Quod naves propter magnitudinem nisi in alto constitui non poterant. Militibus altem ignotis locis impeditis manibus magno et gravi honore armorum oppressis simul et de navibus disiliendum et influctibus consistendum et cum ostibus erat pugnandum cum ilialt ex arido aut palum in aquam progressi omnibus membris expeditis notissimis locis ad actor tela coicerent et equos in sua factos incitarent. Look at that chunky sentence. But as usual, we can break this apart section by section, go comma to comma, and we can figure it out relatively easily. So, first part, erat ob has causas summa difficultas. Okay, so that's relatively easy, relatively straightforward word order. There was erat ob has causas on account of these causes, or for these causes, because of these reasons. There was summa difficultas. There was the greatest difficulty. Quote, because, and I'm looking to see how much I want to divide this. Yeah, so because, and we'll just go to the comma. Because the ships, on account of their magnitude, on account of their size, the ships non poterant were not able to be placed, constitui, in passive infinitive of constituere. So to be set up, to be established, to be placed, to be, I don't know, moored or something. The ships were not able to be placed except nisi, except in alto, except in the deep. So, the Romans aren't able to just push their ships up to the beach and just land and hop out onto the dry land. The ships are big. They can't get close enough to the shore to just hop off and fight, so they have to stay out at a distance. And because of that, well, if you've ever been in like a lake or something, the farther you get from shore, the harder it is to walk back to shore. The Romans aren't, Olympic swimmers by any stretch. So it's going to be really hard for them to get to the beach from a distance, especially with people throwing spears and arrows and, slashing at you with swords. So not going to be the easiest beach landing that you've seen. And then we get here, and look at all this. Militibus altem, ignotis locis, impeditis manibus, magno et gravio honora morum oppressis, similet de navibus, etc., etc. Now, you see militibus and you're like, all right, dative or ablative plural. And then we get ignotis locis. That looks like an ablative absolute. Impeditis manibus, that looks like another ablative absolute. We get some nouns and participles in the ablative, all right. Militibus, however, is not an ablative. It is a dative here, and that's because we go through all of this. We go through an ablative absolute, and then we go through what looks like it should be another ablative absolute, but it's actually just an ablative of means going with the participle oppressis, which, again, you're like, well, militibus and oppressis, how is this not an ablative absolute? Because disiliendum, consistendum, et pugnandum. These are all gerundives. These are all passive paraphrastics. They require a dative. Some dative must disiliendum, consistendum, et pugnandum. So militibus here is a dative as the agent of disiliendum. So it was necessary for the soldiers to jump down, etc., etc. So I'm going to hold off on militibus. But I'm going to go with the other, ablative things we've got here. So, ignotis locis, with the locations unfamiliar, with their hands weighed down, impeded, right, impeditis manibus. So, two ablative absolutes, and then we go back to our dative. The soldiers, oppressed by, ablative of means, oppressed by the great and heavy weight of their arms, of their weapons, the soldiers at the same time had to, disiliendum, had to jump down from the ships and had to kind of stand up in the waves and had to fight with the enemy. So it's a big, long chunk. All right, and that's only a third of this sentence. Again, all datives going off of these passive paraphrastics. For the soldiers, in the unknown locations and with hands weighed down, oppressed by a great and heavy weight, they had to jump from the boats and stand in the waves and fight with the enemy. Cum, illy, and then we get cum here, when, since, or although. Are your choices when you have a cum clause. We first learned that we just go with when. You're never wrong to go with when you're dealing with the cum clause. I always start as when, and then I'll go through and be like, oh, maybe that makes more sense as a since or an although. So let's come back to cum in a little bit. So we'll just start with when and go from there. When illy, those guys. Illy always shows a change of subject. So we were talking about the soldiers here, right? It was necessary for the soldiers to do this, or the boats weren't able to land, or there was difficulty. Those guys, the ones who I wasn't just talking about, so I was just talking about the Romans, so those guys, the barbarians, either from the dry, out ex alrido, out palum in aquam progressi. So those guys, either from the dry land or having progressed a little bit into the water. So they're in shallow water, right? Perfect active participle going with illy. So from the dry or having progressed a little bit into the water. Ablative absolute, mimicking what ablative absolutes we saw with the Romans. With all of their limbs unimpeded, expeditis, and with the locations very well known, they were throwing their spears boldly. They were boldly throwing spears, and they were inciting their trained horses. So Cum clause here, I would perhaps maybe go back with a since here. There was the greatest difficulty for the soldiers who had to do all these things since the barbarians were fighting from the dry or a little bit into the water, and they've got all these other advantages. So I'll go back. I want to point out, again, the kind of mirroring that Caesar does here. So you get the soldiers, and then you get Ignotes Locis. They're fighting in unknown locations. The British, or the Britons, are fighting Notissimis Locis. They're fighting in very well-known locations. The Romans have Impeditis Manibus. They are with impeded hands, or with their hands impeded. The Britons have all of their arms unimpeded. So you get ablative absolutes mirroring each other. They're actually in reverse order. Ignotes Locis A, Impeditis Manibus B, and then Membris Expeditis B again, and then Notissimis Locis A. So you get this A, B, B, A pattern. I don't know if there's significance to that from Caesar, but it's certainly there. So, worth mentioning. All right, so the soldiers, our soldiers, they are having a lot of difficulty for all sorts of reasons, right? For a big, long sentence reason. Last sentence in 24. Quibus rebus nostri perterriti, atque huius omnino generis pugnae imperiti, non eadem alacritate ac studio, quo in pedestribus uti proiliis consuerant, ute bantur. All right. So, it looks like you're starting with an ablative absolute. Technically not, but it's the same sort of idea here. Our men, again, our men, not us, but our men, terrified by such things, by these things. Ablative of means with the passive participle. So our men, terrified by these things, and our men imperiti, huius omnino generis pugnae, inexperienced, unused to, and this is taking a genitive, inexperienced of this generis pugnae, of this type of battle. That is this kind of liminal stage between beach and water, or beach and the deep sea. So, unaccustomed, omnino entirely, completely unaccustomed of this type of fight. Our men, terrified and inexperienced of those things, they non eadem alacritate ac studio quoum pedestribus uti prolis consuerant ute bantur. All right, we have lots of ablatives here because of ute bantur again. Ute bantur, that deponent verb that takes the ablative. So our men, terrified and inexperienced, were using, or in this case, were not using these ablatives. The same alacritate ac studio. They were not using the same zeal and zeal. This is Caesar again using somewhat synonymous words to perhaps emphasize the point. It's showing perhaps one is the kind of physical manifestation of the idea, whereas the other is just kind of the abstract concept. So, I mean, you could go with alacrity and zeal, or enthusiasm and zeal. I think the alacritate is like the actual manifestation of this energy and this enthusiasm. So they weren't using the same sort of energy, and they didn't also have the same sort of mindset, the same sort of zeal. So, theoretically, you could probably translate them with the same word. You could translate both with like enthusiasm. I would encourage you not to do that, but theoretically you could. So they weren't using the same zeal and enthusiasm, which, quo, referring to the studio and alacritate, which, and here quo is an ablative again because of uti. So ute bantur, and we had uti up above, right? If I can find it. Yeah, uti consuerant. And actually, I mean, this sentence up at the very beginning, quo plurem quo genere in prolis uti consuerant, quoum pedestribus uti proelis consuerant. So the same sort of pattern. So our men were not using the same zeal and enthusiasm which they were accustomed to use. And again, quo ablative, because of this deponent verb, they were accustomed to use this in pedestribus proelis. I don't know why Caesar has separated pedestribus and proelis by uti. I don't. It just makes it harder to read. So they don't use the same zeal and enthusiasm which they are accustomed to using in pedestrian battles, in foot battles, right, or battles on foot. The Romans' preferred method of fighting is just line up in nice orderly columns and just march over the enemy like a monster truck rally or something. Whereas the Britons here are fighting a bit more chaotically, a little bit more kind of pop in, attack, run away. The Romans are not used to that. It's similar from what I remember learning about in the Revolutionary War, where the Britons, ironically, have completely changed their style. They just want to stand in lines, stand in nice orderly columns, and take turns firing shots over each other, right? A kind of a Red Rover of bullets. But the Americans kind of adapted the guerrilla warfare, where they kind of hide and ambush and run away. And they were able to beat the Britons because they weren't playing the Britons' game. And it's kind of the same thing with the Romans here. The Romans are struggling against the Britons now because they're not playing the Britons' game. Spoilers, the Romans will ultimately come out victorious. All right, so that does it for 24. We still haven't landed on the beach. We should be able to land on the beach in the next battle, or in the next section, but we'll save that for next time. So, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below, or email me, or just hit me up in class. That does it for today. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching. Have a great one, and I will see you next time.